When you first dive into the legal system, it can honestly feel like a massive, tangled web of rules, just chaos. But it's actually much more useful to picture the law as a meticulously organized filing cabinet. Seriously, every single human interaction, every conflict, and every right you possess already has a specific, clearly labeled folder. Understanding this exact taxonomy gives us a massive advantage in decoding society itself. Okay, let's dive into this explainer and crack open that first drawer.
Here is our roadmap for today. We're going to start with global versus domestic law, look at the what versus the how, and then break down public versus private law. After that, we'll explore a tale of two laws, dive into the actual branches of the law, and finish up by going beyond the basics.
All right, starting off with Section 1, Global versus Domestic Law, the broadest view.
Right at the very top of our legal filing cabinet, the whole system splits into two massive overarching categories. On one side, we've got international law. That's the law of nations, governing relationships between completely independent states through things like treaties and conventions. On the other side is national law, or domestic law, which is basically the entire body of rules applied and enforced within the borders of one specific country. Now, you might think these two sit in completely separate, sealed-off filing cabinets, right? But they really don't. Just take a look at Section 39(1) of the Constitution. It specifically mandates that when a court interprets the Domestic Bill of Rights, it absolutely must consider international law. It's a beautiful illustration of how these massive global agreements echo all the way down into a nation's own domestic rulebook.
Moving right along to Section 2, the what versus the how, substantive and procedural law.
Once we crack open that domestic system, everything splits right down the middle again. Think of substantive law as the what. It determines the actual meat of the rules, prohibits specific crimes, and establishes your legal rights. And then there's procedural law. That is the how. It's literally the practical instruction manual regulating exactly how those substantive rules get enforced and how cases are actually handled in the real world. And here is the crucial takeaway. Just having a big list of rules, it's basically useless on its own. I mean, it makes absolutely no sense to tell people they have rights if you don't actually prescribe a peaceful, orderly method for fixing things when those rights get trampled on. Without procedural law to guide the enforcement of the rules, society descends into chaos, and people will just rely on physical force to get their way. Procedure is the exact thing that keeps the peace.
So, what does this procedural instruction manual actually look like? Well, it's generally chopped up into three main sections. First, you have the law of criminal procedure, which dictates how the state prosecutes a suspect, how bail works, sentencing, the whole shebang. Second is the law of civil procedure, which lays out the exact steps for handling private disputes, like how you properly serve a summons on a defendant. And third, the law of evidence, which very strictly controls exactly how facts have to be presented and proven inside a court of law.
All right, Section 3, Public versus Private Law, the geometry of power.
Let's pivot back to that substantive law rulebook for a second, because the biggest split inside it is all about power dynamics. First up, we have public law. This is deeply concerned with the welfare of the state and the community as a whole. It governs the relationship between the incredibly powerful state and you, the everyday citizen. This creates a vertical, inherently unequal relationship. Then you have private law, which relates to the welfare of particular individuals. It deals with relationships strictly between citizen and citizen, like a marriage or signing a business contract. This creates a horizontal and theoretically totally equal relationship.
Which brings us to Section 4, a tale of two laws when categories collide.
So what exactly happens when these two categories crash into each other out in the real world? Let's say person A decides to steal person B's property. Believe it or not, this one single act triggers both branches of the law at the exact same time. Vertically, over in public law, the state steps in and prosecutes person A because theft harms the broader community. But horizontally, in private law, person B can institute a civil action to claim compensation for their loss. One single action, two entirely different legal mechanisms at play. Let's dive into Section 5, Branches of the Law, zooming in to the granular details. Okay, let's open up the three main drawers inside the public law cabinet. Think of constitutional law as the architect. It builds and organizes the state into the legislature, the judiciary, and the executive branches. Administrative law acts as the manager. It controls exactly how those state departments and boards are allowed to exercise their power over citizens.
And finally, criminal law is the enforcer. It explicitly states which acts go against the community's interest and what the state's punishments are going to be. If we look a little closer at administrative law, we actually find the ultimate shield for you, the everyday citizen, against the massive vertical power of the state. Section 33 of the Constitution flat out guarantees that state bodies cannot exercise their powers randomly or unfairly. Every single administrative action has to be lawful, reasonable, and fair. Legislation like the Promotion of Administrative Justice Act, or PAJA, gives real teeth to this right. It ensures that when the state acts, it doesn't just get to do whatever it wants.
Now, sliding right over to the private law side, those horizontal relationships governing our personal day-to-day lives. The law of persons maps your entire existence from birth all the way to death. Family law handles things like marriages and guardianships. The law of patrimony governs your personal wealth. And finally, intellectual property protects the amazing creations of your mind, like your inventions or writings.
And you know, that patrimony folder is incredibly important because it holds 3 subdivisions that pretty much dictate our entire daily economic life. Property law classifies our things into movables, like cars, and immovables, like land. The law of succession dictates exactly who inherits your property through wills when you pass away. And then we have the incredibly vital law of obligations, which governs the specific duties we owe to one another through contracts and delicts. Think of an obligation as the absolute engine of private commerce. It's really just a legal relationship where one party has the right to demand some kind of performance and the other party has the corresponding duty to actually perform it. You can create these obligations intentionally by agreeing to them in a contract, or they can arise through unjustified enrichment. But they can also arise completely by accident.
Which brings us right to what we call a delict. A delict is basically a wrongful act that causes damage to somebody else, but, and this is the crucial part, where there is absolutely no prior agreement between the people involved. If you sign a lease, okay, that's a contract. But if a total stranger crashes their car straight into your living room, that is a delict. In a delict, the law steps in and artificially creates an obligation for the wrongdoer to pay you damages, even though you obviously never signed a contract agreeing to the crash.
Finally, Section 6, Beyond the Basics, the supplementary folders.
Ask yourself this. What happens if Lorato, who is South African, marries Pedro, who is Italian, while they're on a vacation in Scotland? I mean, whose marriage laws actually apply there? It's a super messy horizontal relationship that is suddenly crossing vertical state borders. This hypothetical directly demonstrates exactly why the system needs a highly specific folder called Private International Law, which is specifically designed to untangle these tricky cross-border private relationships.
So, to round out the whole system, we have these sort of catch-all supplementary folders. Alongside private international law, we have commercial law, which pulls together all the rules for trade, insurance, and taxes. We've got jurisprudence, which examines the law from a deeply philosophical perspective. We have legal interpretation, which is the incredibly strict science of determining exactly what a specific statute really means. And we have comparative law and legal history, which study foreign systems and our own past to help us better understand the rules we're living with today.
We've seen today just how beautifully and systematically the law categorizes literally everything, from a massive global treaty all the way down to a minor fender bender. But I want to leave you with this somewhat provocative thought to wrap up this explainer. If the law so neatly organizes every human interaction, does this pristine taxonomy actually dictate the messy reality of our relationships? Or did the chaotic, incredibly messy reality of human life simply force the creation of these categories over time? Thanks so much for exploring this with us, and as always, keep questioning the systems around you.